Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
The conversation we're going to have now is about the faithful prostitute, which sounds like it might open up a can of worms. But let's just work out where we are in the storyline. What's happening? Where are we in the point in history?
Well, the character we're going to look at today, this faithful prostitute, comes up in Joshua chapter 2. Now, Joshua is all about Israel entering their promised land. So, backstory, they've been slaves in Egypt. They have been rescued from there by God's deliverance and under Moses' leadership. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've gone south to Mount Sinai, received God's law there. Because of disobedience, end up wandering around in the wilderness for 38 years. And now, 40 years on from when they left Egypt, they have now come to the east side of the River Jordan, just above the Dead Sea, where the River Jordan comes into the Dead Sea. And they're about to do what they have been looking forward to, not just for the last 40 years of wilderness wanderings, but really what was promised to them way back to their forefathers, to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the patriarch, and that is to enter and possess the land that God had promised them. The land at that time known as Canaan, though it was actually made up of many small city-states and people groups rather than a nation as such. So they're on the edge of inheriting their inheritance. The whole of the people of Israel are on the east side of the Jordan. They're about to go in and take their land. But first they need to know what is it that lies ahead of them.
So the people of Israel have been building up to this moment for hundreds of years.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, there is inevitably a sense of excitement, anticipation. What God promised to us all those years ago is at last about to be fulfilled. But of course, they're going to have to work into that promise. It's not just going to land into their laps. There's going to be battles to be fought and land to be taken. But yeah, I think the sense of excitement and expectation at this point must have been incredible.
So there's a military element, of course, to this, and therefore they have to check out where they are going.
Yeah, and as a sort of military operation, one of the first things that good military leaders do is to reconnoiter, to recce the land, isn't it? And that's exactly what we find happening at the beginning of Joshua. So in Joshua chapter 1, God has commissioned Joshua to be the leader to take over from Moses, who has died without entering the promised land. And having commissioned them, one of the first things that Joshua does, who proves, by the way, to be an incredible strategist. As we read through Joshua, the decisions he prayerfully makes are a really good strategy from a military point of view. And the first thing he does is to want to recce the land. So chapter 2 of Joshua begins with the words, Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab, the faithful prostitute we'll be looking at a moment, and stayed there. So let's just take the first part of that sentence first of all. Go and look over the land, especially Jericho. So it's a secret reconnoitering mission, rather like military commanders would do today, except, they might use satellites these days rather than send people, I suppose. No satellites in those days, so the spies are going to go and look what faces them. Notice he says there, go and look especially at Jericho. Now, why does he highlight that? Because Jericho is the first city that they're going to face. There were 3 major roads in those days. The first ran from Egypt up the coast, then cut across the plain of Galilee, heading up towards the northeast and then down to the mighty nations in Mesopotamia. The second major highway ran to the east of the River Jordan. The first was called the Way of the Sea. This second one to the east of the Jordan called the King's Highway. Now, linking those roads in the south was this road that ran right by Jericho. So it's a road that, as it were, cuts the nation of Canaan into two halves. And Jericho is a fortress city. It's been placed there deliberately to protect that road. Now, we know that it's one of the oldest fortified cities in the world, and it must have seemed absolutely impregnable to these Israelites who had heard about it and who would soon see it. Archaeologists have actually uncovered its walls now. They're 4.5 feet thick, which for those days was really incredible. It had, huge round towers. It was an oasis. One of its names was the City of Palms, it was also called. So it had a good water supply, which obviously you need if you're going to be under siege. So it's a strong fortress city guarding this road link between the King's Highway to the east of the Jordan and the Way of the Sea by the Mediterranean. So a really, really strategic city from a military point of view, but actually a really strategic city probably from a spiritual point of view as well, because it was almost certainly a center of moon worship. The Hebrew word Jericho sounds very like the Hebrew word for moon. So it may well at this point have been possessed by moon worshippers. So this is also going to be a spiritual battle about whose God is the greatest.
So the spies are sent to check it out, this fortress city, strategically placed. How does this prostitute come to be involved?
Well, it comes about through, I think, some wisdom on the part of these two spies. We read there in that verse that I read, they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Now, lest we think there's any hanky-panky monkey business going on here, there's no suggestion of that in the story at all. But of course, the home of a prostitute would be very used to having people coming and going from it. It would be particularly used to having visitors and strangers coming and going, perhaps a bit like in some of our naval ports around the world where there are red light districts near the port, and it would be very common for the visiting sailors to visit there. So what they're doing is they are taking advantage of a cultural situation that would be a good cover, a good disguise for them. They're passing through and people might think, who are those? Not seen those guys before. Oh, they're going to Rahab's house. Yes, we all know why they're going there. Though, as I said, no suggestion of anything immoral going on here at all. It's simply a good cover, but they're going to discover there a woman in whose heart God has been working.
Because she lives in Jericho, has never met these spies before, doesn't know anything about the Israelites, presumably.
Well, she's heard about them, which is interesting because as she goes on to talk with these guys, we discover that, the rumors have gone ahead. Now, if you think about it, that's not unusual. We've got a people movement of 2 to 2.5 million people who've been on the move for the last 40 years, heading their way. So, while there's no Facebook or Apple News to catch up on the latest news events, things like that the stories would definitely have travelled. And she's certainly heard about them. And it's because she's heard about what has been happening that she does the action that she does. So let's just look at what she's heard first before then we look at what she did. She says to them from verse 9, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. what you did to Zion and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts sank, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Note she says that the Lord your God. So this is not her God at this moment, but she has heard what their God has been doing. Not only has she heard, but clearly others have heard. She says the whole country has heard about what has been happening.
She's heard a lot.
She's heard an awful lot. The news has travelled, hasn't it? But I suppose the sort of things that we're talking about there is news that would travel pretty quickly. And people did travel in those days. There were travellers, there were traders. Traders were one of the most common sources for taking news backwards and forwards. So she has heard both about the Israelites, but more importantly, about the Israelites' God, and recognizes that he has been doing these things for them.
These spies presumably are looking for her help.
Yeah, absolutely. And the first help, of course, is some protection there from what is going on. The king of Jericho hears, it would only have been a small city in those days. News travels fast. Hey, we've seen these two guys. We think they might be from those Israelite people. And so the king of Jericho sends a message to Rahab and says, bring me the men who've come to your house, because they've come here as spies to spy out the whole land. But we read this, that she'd taken the two men and hidden them. And she said, yes, the men did come to me, but I didn't know where they'd come from. And at dusk, when it was time to close the city gates, the men left, and I don't know which way they went. But go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. But then the author adds, but she'd actually taken them up on the roof and had hidden them under the stalks of flax that she'd laid out on the roof. Roofs in those days were always flat because they were used as an additional room. They were used for drying clothes. They were used for, here what we've got, putting crops there that could be threshed or dried out. And she's obviously got some flax up there on the roof and a pile of it, and hides them under this. So clearly she has acted on their behalf.
And told a big white lie.
Yes, she has, hasn't she? She's lied there to protect them. And out of that, the men that the king had sent pursued them to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone, we read, the gate was shut, but the spies lay down for the night. And that's when she goes up onto the roof and says those words that we've just read, I've heard what has been doing. So she's sticking her neck out here. She is taking steps of faith, which is why we've called this episode the Faithful Prostitute. Now, obviously, the very nature of a prostitute means that he or she is not faithful at all. That's the nature of the work. Whoever has the money gets the use of them. But here is a woman who, although her whole life has been faithless and has been driven by this need to get money for her services, she will now prove to be full of faith, and that faith gets seen in action. The first of which is simply hiding them when the king sends his messengers coming looking for them, and then telling them the reason that she's hidden them is that she knows what God has done. And then she makes this plea to them. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I've shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you'll spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. So she's saying, listen, I've protected you guys. When I know that you are going to come and take this land, as I surely know you are, I'm asking that at that point you would protect me and my family just as I have protected you. And the spies give an assurance of that they will indeed protect her if they don't tell what they are doing.
Because I guess this isn't the first time she's hidden men in her property for perhaps other reasons, if you know what I mean. And her life is potentially on the line here. The king's after these men, but she's not going to come off very well.
Very much so. And I think that's again an expression of the incredible faith that she is starting to exercise. It's interesting. It's a growing thing, isn't it? It is not yet, I want to give my life to the living God, but there's a growing thing. I've heard, I've seen what God is doing. I mean, still today, that's how a journey to faith happens for many people. They see God at work. They hear what God is doing in the lives of other Christians or in churches around about and become fascinated and want to know more. And that's something of a journey that she is on. But you're absolutely right, David. I mean, this is risky. In those days, kings would have, given no grace to someone like that, would have been off with her head instantly if he had known that she had lied to them. So in doing what she does, in protecting them and actually then going on to help them escape, because the story goes on to say that she lets them down by a rope through a window because her house was actually built into the wall of the city. Let's not think of, fortified cities here like some of the medieval castles we get in the United Kingdom with this outer wall and everything inside. In those days, walls would simply have been added in between the houses that were at the edge of the city as well. And her house happens to be part of the wall of the city. She's got a window that looks out, and so she lets this rope down through the window and lowers them down through that so that they can escape, and says, look, go to the hills, give it 3 days until they've stopped looking for you, and then you will be able to escape.
I'm intrigued by the level of trust she has in them. It said when you were reading it that she'd heard what the Lord God had done, and then she meets them. She's never met them before. She hears from them directly, no doubt, what God has planned. And I'm just, fascinated by the fact that, bearing in mind her life must have been taken up with people who she couldn't trust and people who didn't trust her, that here she is trusting these people to keep their promise.
Wow, that's a powerful thought, David, that her life had been taken up by people she couldn't trust, people who didn't care about her. I think we know these days, don't we, that the vast majority of people who end up in a life of prostitution end up in it because they feel they have no alternative. They're driven to the end of themselves. They see it as the only way that they can make money, sometimes make money for their kids. And so, it is a sad and desperate life. And you're quite right. This woman would simply have been used by people. It would have been very hard to trust any of them. And yet, for some reason that we're not told, but I suspect is nothing other than the working of God in her heart. And when we come to a place in life where we are going to give our lives to God and give our lives to Jesus, it's rarely a one-off moment. It's often the result of a whole number of things coming together, contact with a number of different Christians, hearing the Christian message in different ways, meeting with Christian people, watching their lives. And it can be a process. But at the end of the day, it does need God to open our eyes and open our hearts. And I think there is process here. She's heard from stories of what have happened. As you said, they almost certainly talked to her as well about what God had done for them. And little by little, she is opening her heart here in trust to these people, because, they could have turned around and killed her and said, thank you very much for the bet for the night, sword in your ribs. And yet there's something in their hearts too that recognize, I think, something is happening here. God is at work in this woman's life. She is starting to show faith. And there's lots of these little steps of faith in what she does, in taking them in hiding them, in that lie to the king to protect them, in asking them to protect her, in letting them down through the window, and in the final thing that will actually save them, because the spies say to her, well, look, we'll need a way to know which your house is, when all these people come. So what we want you to do is to tie a scarlet cord to your window, and we will say to everyone, that is the house you are to spare. That is the family you are to spare where you see that. So even that was like a step of faith, because when you think about it, it's bonkers, tying a red cord to a window in what would have been a chaotic situation of battle and fighting. And yet she does exactly what she is told. And as we'll come to the story of Jericho in a future episode, she will actually be spared because of that faith. So, an incredible process of growing faith here. But faith that's not just sort of words or feelings, faith that is turned into her actions. It's her actions that show her faith. And actually, she will be picked up in the New Testament as an example of faith, which is pretty incredible. James, in James chapter 2, refers back to her as, her faith wasn't just about words. She turned her faith into action. She's listed there in Hebrews 11 as one of the heroes of faith of the Old Testament. So clearly this woman made an incredible change and an incredible impact by this faith in turning away from what was probably her worship of the moon god to turning to trusting the living God and becoming part of his people.
So she's let the spies go. Her life still is at risk, of course, but how does the story continue?
Yes, it is at risk, isn't it? And the story continues by the spies doing what she'd said, staying hidden for 3 days and then crossing back over to the east side. Interesting little point, by the way. We note that the spies ford the river. Just bear that little thought in mind for a future episode when we're looking at Israel crossing the river and it's no longer fordable but in flood, which we'll talk about in the next episode. So they go back. Joshua makes his plans for invading the country that God has promised them. They do that. They take the city in an amazing way, a very surprising way that also we'll look at next time. But she is spared in exactly the way that it was promised. And so as we read about that in chapter 6, we can pick up the story at this point that verse 21, they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, donkeys. But Joshua said to the 2 men who'd spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family, and they put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. So she is spared. And she now presumably becomes part of the people of God as they take up their inheritance in the promised land. So her faith was rewarded. And as I've said, that faith is mentioned several times in the New Testament and is highlighted that how are we put right with God? We're put right with God through faith, through putting our trust in him. It's not through what we do for him. It's through faith, through believing in him, a faith here that got worked out in practice.
So God, to all intents and purposes, used her.
Absolutely. In fact, how would the story have unfolded without her? Well, I'm sure our surprising God would have had another way of doing it. But she does prove to be an incredible part of this mission in helping the spies and is rewarded because of what she has done. And the incredible thing is, we know that she does become part of God's people for the simple reason that she is included in the genealogy of Jesus.
Oh, really?
who is obviously descended from and part of God's people. Rahab is one of just 4 women mentioned in the genealogy at the beginning of Matthew's gospel. Now, that genealogy is not complete. That's not how they worked in those days. It just picked out selected key figures. And Matthew gives us 3 blocks of 14 names, including Tamar, who was the wife chosen by Judah for his son, Rahab, the woman we're looking at, Ruth, the Moabitess, in the period of the Judges, who is faithful to her mother-in-law, and Bathsheba. So we know that this woman, this faithful prostitute Rahab, did become part of the people of God because she ends up finding her place in the genealogy of Jesus. She's one of Jesus's ancestors. Wow. If that is not being included, then I don't know what is.
So if Jesus was the focus of that TV series, Who Do You Think You Are? And you go back through the family tree, there's Rahab.
Absolutely. And it would be more shocking than some of those where they go back and discover that Henry VIII was one of their ancestors long, long ago. What an amazing thing to think that someone like this, an outsider, an outcast, someone who is despised by people, used by people, rubbish, just someone there to be used when they wanted to, through her faith finds herself included in the people of God, in that ancestral line of Jesus. What could be more of an honor and a privilege than that for this faithful prostitute?
Not only, of course, is she a woman, but she's a Gentile.
Yes, and all 4 of those that I mentioned, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, all 4 of them were not only women, but were also Gentiles. So here is a picture of how, although God's plan started with a particular people, the nation of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their 12 sons that became the 12 tribes. Yes, this was God's choice, but the story did not end with them. The story simply started with them. They were the vehicle, the family, the nation that God would use to reach out to all people, to reach out even to these Gentile women who would have been seen as outsiders, beyond the pale. You know, for many Jews, particularly as Jewish history went on, they came to look upon Gentiles not as people that God loved and wanted to see saved, but as people that God hated and wanted to see judged, and that they despised. And they forgot that the promise to Abraham had been that he would become a father of a family of faith that would fill the whole earth, and that through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And Rahab serves as an amazing example of how, where God's concerned, no one needs to be excluded. Even those who feel themselves the most outside, the most despised, the most misused, those who the world cares nothing for, they are not excluded by God. In fact, they are the ones that God often takes and brings into his family and uses in an incredible way, as the story of this faithful prostitute shows us.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.